Salut and welcome to another episode of French Lessons with Anna. And today we're going to talk about one of the many past tenses we have in French, l'imparfait. L'imparfait is an easy tense to form. Sometimes its usage is not as easy as it seems, but don't be afraid because once we go over this, you will see that it's not as hard as people sometimes make it. If you want to know the difference between imparfait and passé composé, look for that episode as it is a different lesson where I actually explain in more detail the differences between a passé composé, which is a simple past tense, and this one that we're going to see today, which is the imparfait. And just like everything else in French, it has regular and irregular verbs. But you will see that when it comes to irregular verbs, this one is quite easily, to do. So let's begin. How do we form the imparfait in French? Remember that I told you when we did the passé composé that the past tense in French can be the passé récent, which means just finished doing something. It can be the passé composé, I did something. And this one now, which is I used to do something or I was doing something. We still have another one to go, which is the plus parfait, but we'll talk about that one later on. Now, this one is very simple to form. If you know the present tense of verbs, look at the nous. That's what that one says, okay? Première personne du pluriel, nous au présent de l'indicatif, okay? So when you have to form the imparfait, this is it. Just look at the new form in the present tense, and every new form in the present, whether it's regular or irregular, will have ONS as its ending. And that's what we have here in the second one. There is only one exception to the rule, which makes imparfait quite easy to form, okay? So, on élève la terminaison ONS. That means that when you look at the new form, get rid of the ending ONS. Even if it's an IR verb, which in the present tense has ISS-ONS as an ending, don't get rid of the entire thing, just ONS. And once you get rid of ONS, it says here, on ajoute les terminaisons suivantes. So we actually add the following endings. And the endings for imparfait are very easy. For je, as you can see over here, it's AIS, A-I-S. For tu, it's the same thing, A-I-S. Il, elle, singular, on, it's AIT, so it just changes the S to a T. Then the new form is IONS, A-I-O-N-S, right? The vous, I-E-Z, I-Z, and then the il and elle plural, A-I-E-N-T. Now, the other thing that is very interesting is that je, tu, il, elle, on, and then il and elle plural all sound the same. So, AIS is E, tu, E, il, elle, on, E. And then for nous, it's ion. For vous, it's ye. And then for il and elle plural, ils and elles. Remember, we don't pronounce that S. So it's E as well. So how does this work? Well, let's look at a verb from what I call the first group, the ER. And I chose a very common verb, parler, to speak or to talk. So in the present tense, if you are to conjugate that verb in the new form, it's nous parlons. Remember, we drop the ER and it becomes ONS. And now the imparfait tells me that once I figure out what the new form of the present tense is, I get rid of that ONS. And that's what I have there. And then you just add the endings for imparfait. And this is what it looks like. Je parlais, A-I-S. Tu parlais, A-I-S. Il parlait, elle parlait, on parlait. So, I used to talk or I was talking, so it has both meanings. You used to talk or you were talking. He, she, and we. Remember, this on is a very informal, casual way of speaking. It actually means we, but it's conjugated as il and elle singular. So, parlait. Then we, nous, right? Nous parlions. We used to talk. We were talking. Vous, that means you plural or the formal, respectful way of treating someone in French. Vous parliez. And then il parlait. Remember, the S is not pronounced. And elle parlait. So that's the first group of verbs. What do you think is going to happen with the next one? Well, kind of the same thing. So if you look at a verb from an RE group, such as entendre, this verb means to hear. The verbs in RE in the present tense also have ONS for nous, right? And the nous is nous entendons. And once you get rid of that ONS, look what happens to it. J'entendais, tu entendais, il entendait, elle entendait, on entendait. So you got rid of the ONS and you're replacing it for each one, for each subject pronoun, you're replacing it with its respective ending. Nous entendions, vous entendiez, ils entendaient, elles entendaient. And here, notice that I'm doing the liaison because this is a vowel. So even though we don't pronounce the S in il and el plural, as soon as we see that vowel, we sort of connect them with a z sound, right? So, ils entendaient, elles entendaient. All right? So I used to hear, or I was hearing something, you used to hear, and so on and so forth. Okay? And the next group, the IR group. Remember what I said? IR verbs in the present tense have ISS, ONS, but we don't get rid of the ISS part. We just get rid of ONS because that's what the rule in the Imparfait tells us to do. So we keep the ISS part. And then we add the endings the same way, right? So we have je choisissais, tu choisissais. Notice that ISS is there. Il choisissait, elle choisissait, on choisissait. Nous choisissions, vous choisissiez. Looks like a lot of I's are going on there, right? But it's correct. Il choisissait and elle choisissait. Okay? So you got rid of the ONS and you're replacing it with the imparfait endings. So that takes care of the regular verbs, right? ER, RE, IR. What happens if in the present tense a verb is irregular? Well, if you remember from the present tense lesson, the definition of regular or irregular in French or any other language for that matter is a regular verb follows the rule, obeys the law, as we always say. So if the rule that is established, okay, is you are going to look at ONS and replace it with something else, then that verb is regular because it follows the rule. As soon as a verb does not follow the rule, and then it becomes irregular. It breaks that law, okay? Now, in the case of verbs, it doesn't mean that if a verb is irregular in one tense, that it needs to be irregular in every other tense. You will see there is only one verb in French that is irregular throughout, only one, and we'll see it momentarily. You can have other verbs that are regular in the present, irregular in the imparfait, irregular in the passé composé, regular in the future. So that all depends if they are able to follow the rule that has been established, right? So, having said this, if a verb in the present tense is irregular, but the new form still has ONS, it becomes regular in the imparfait because it can follow the rule that has been established in the imparfait. And that's what that means. Si un verbe irrégulier au présent de l'indicatif a la terminaison ONS, il devient régulier à l'imparfait. Okay? So if an irregular verb in the present tense has that ONS ending, then it is regular in the imparfait because it can follow the rule. Look at faire, and there's many, right? Avoir, vouloir, pouvoir, devoir. All those verbs that are irregular in the present, they have ONS, just like faire does. So if you look at faire in the present tense, je fais, tu fais, il fait, elle, on fait, nous faisons. So there's that ONS we're talking about. So if there's an ONS, get rid of it because that's what imparfait says and work with what you have. So you're left with FAIS. How do you conjugate it in the imparfait? By then adding the endings from the imparfait. And so it becomes, as you can see over here, je faisais, tu faisais, il, elle, on faisait, nous faisions, vous faisiez, il faisait, elle faisait. So this verb that is actually irregular in the present becomes regular and imparfait because of the fact that it has an ONS as its ending, and you can replace it with the imparfait. You can follow the rule, okay? So the same applies, as I said, to any irregular verb like that. Vouloir, pouvoir, aller, devoir, I don't know, all the verbs, dormir, all the verbs that are irregular, okay? So what is this strange verb that is always irregular? You probably guessed it, it's être. Être is the verb to be. Être means to be, right? So it's the only verb in French that will always be irregular. And in the case of the imparfait, il y a seulement un verbe irrégulier à l'imparfait. In the imparfait case, it's the only verb that is irregular because it's the only verb that the new form doesn't have ONS. That's the reason, okay? So, because we can't work with ONS in the present, le radical pour être est. So the root, the radical, which is that part before the endings, for the imparfait becomes et. But notice that être has an accent circonflexe, which is that little hat, becomes accent aigu when it changes to imparfait. Être, and this is et. It's going to be an open air. So how do we conjugate this guy? The good news is that the endings are the same. They never, ever change. So here you go. The reason why we have this être, right, is very simple. Because the present tense, so présent indicatif, the verb être is nous sommes. There's no ONS. Il n'y a pas de ONS. Donc, il ne suit pas la règle de l'imparfait. It does not follow the rule. It makes him a bad guy. He doesn't follow the rules, okay? But it's easy because the endings never change. So here you go. J'étais. The endings are the same. Tu étais. Il était. Elle était. On était. Notice that here I have a vowel, this and that carries over. On était. Nous étions, right? So you have the S here. You will have to have the Z sound. Nous étions. And then the vous étiez, same thing. Vous étiez. Ils étaient. And elles étaient. Okay? So that means I used to be or I was being something. Okay? I used to is the common thing here. Now, keep in mind that with the imparfait, this verb and actually in the passé in general, this verb has a tendency of being in the imparfait a lot of times, okay? So we will see, like I said, look at the lesson with passé composé versus imparfait, because there you will see more examples of when to use this, okay? Now, when do we use the imparfait? Well, as we said, c'est un temps du passé, right? C'est un temps au passé. It means that it's over. It's a tense that refers to the past. Then it's also an habitude. It means that if it's the idea of used to do something in the past, when I was 5, I used to go out with my parents every weekend, for example. So that was a repetition of something in the past. You no longer do it because you're no longer 5. Or maybe if you're still that age, you're not doing that anymore. So it's in the past. But it's a past that has a tendency of repeated actions, okay? C'est aussi le temps de la description. When you're describing something in the past in French, always use the imparfait because it's sort of the idea of used to, but when you're describing, it has that continuation to it, okay? So, for example, ma maison était blanche. My house was white, right? It's not that it was white one day and then the following day another color. So it was white for a while. Well, that while forces you to use the imparfait. Expliquer une situation au passé, right? Because it requires you to explain something. It's not just, this morning I got up. Okay, that's a passé composé. But if you're going to tell me that you used to get up every morning to do something because you took really good care of something, whatever the case may be, then you have to use the imparfait. Action en cours dans le passé. That means that it's when we translate it as was doing something. I was reading a book when you called me. When you called me is the action that interrupts, so that's the passé composé. But me reading, I was reading probably for an hour or two. So that time period, it's a description in itself, right? So that has to be imparfait. If you were to imagine the timeline, right, in the past, every single interruption is a passé composé. It's that dot. And when you have something flowing, like a line flowing, that is your imparfait. Now, the imparfait is also used as une hypothèse. So this means we use it with if clauses. We call them phrases conditionnelles, okay? So, si plus imparfait, and then on the other side, conditionnel. Check out the lesson on phrases conditionnelles, which are the if clauses, where we explain the imparfait and the role it plays when we want to express it as an hypothesis, okay? And then certaines formules de politesse. That just means that it can be even in the present tense, but to be polite, you will use the imparfait. Actually, in this case, imparfait and conditionnel are used quite often. For example, if I wanted you to pass me something, I could say, pouvez-vous, for example, pouvez-vous me dire quelle heure est-il? Could you please tell me what time it is? So as a form of being polite, of politesse, you will use the imparfait, even if it's in the present tense. But it's the only time. It's the only time. The other times, it's always referring to something in the past. So this is la formation de l'imparfait. Like I said, how to use it and all the exceptions to the rule is another lesson. Look at it, passé composé versus imparfait. And you will find very soon some links to exercises as well for you to practice. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comments and I will try to either create another episode or try to help you as much as I can. Thank you. À la prochaine.